welcome to MindSpeak, and it's a real pleasure.
We're going to take a deep dive into mining, the oil and gas sector, extractive industries. We're going to take a focus on the EITI, the voluntary principles on security and human rights. And I'm very grateful to my esteemed guests, His Excellency Jacques Blue, His Excellency David Angel, who have kindly supported this particular MindSpeak from Switzerland and from Canada. We've got a bunch of great guests here today as well. I'd like to introduce one of our MindSpeak alumni,
Ambassador Peter Liu.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, and because this is Kenya, I'm going to say all protocols observed. Good morning. It is really a pleasure and an honor to welcome you on the occasion of today's MindSpeak on the voluntary principles on security and human rights. This event is co-hosted by the Canadian High Commission and by the Swiss Embassy. Both countries, Switzerland and Canada, are member states of the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights initiative, and we would thus like to share our experiences we have made with this initiative so far. The reason why we would like to promote the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights with regard to the Kenyan context is quite obvious. After the discovery of oil in Turkana in March last year, and the subsequent discovery of a substantive deposit of oil and natural gas offshore Lamu and near Malindi, it is absolutely clear that Kenyan and international companies dealing in extractive industries are keen to move ahead with the exploration of the precious natural resources and to start exporting them. And this should really happen in a framework which guarantees a modicum of respect for human rights. So that we will keep in touch with the Kenyan government to make sure that all stakeholders try really to improve the situation on this. So with this, I would just like to finish and to wish you a very successful panel, and thank you, Ali Khan, for organizing this with us. We really appreciate your help. Thank you.
Cliff was born and raised in Nairobi. He holds a Bachelor of Science and a Master of Commerce from Australian universities. He has over 10 years' experience with the global extractives industry. Began his engagement with the extractives industry at KPMG in Western Australia, advising clients such as BHP Billiton, which is the world's largest diversified natural resources organization, Woodside Energy, Shell Australia, Iluka Resources and Premier Coal. Later joined Canadian Copper, gold, nickel and zinc producer First Quantum Minerals during a period of rapid growth in Zambia, the DRC, Mauritania, South America, Finland and Australia. Cliff is currently Managing Director at Standard & Mutual, a Nairobi-based corporate finance advisory firm. Standard & Mutual is a nominated advisor for the NSE's Growth and Enterprise Market segment, GEMS, where a lot of people are hoping some of these mining companies that we're going to hopefully see are going to come and list and allow all of us to participate in the mining industry. Cliff, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali Khan, for that illustrious introduction. The truth is, these are interesting times because a story has been formed around mining in Kenya, and of course, those who are familiar with the industry, and even those who are not, are at least familiar with the massive perceived and in some cases actual returns that this sort of industry can bring to a country. Of course, we also need to temper that expectation with the reality that natural resources have not been a boon for every African country that has discovered and tried to exploit them. Fundamentally, mining is it's a business, you know. Mining is no different from, say, a Safaricom or a tourism or agriculture, because at the end of the day, you have a product, you exploit that product has a market price, there's a cost to extract it, and if you can do that economically and make a profit as an investor, then you'll do it. And if you can't, you won't. But of course, the unique thing with extractive industry is that these resources are finite. Insofar as you identify an economic deposit, you have a certain number of tons or barrels of oil or what have you, and at some point, 10 years, 100 years, that resource will be depleted. And I think this is the genesis of the conflict, and some around Africa, and here in Kenya, it's the genesis of the very public debate around who gets to mine these resources and what the people of Kenya and the people of East Africa in general get back from their resources. The leader in terms of mining around the world, and these are 2010 figures actually, and these were verified last year, so I choose to use these figures as the most up to date. So Australia basically produces $71 billion of minerals every year. China, not surprisingly, is also comes in a close second, and of course Brazil is also a powerhouse. Those are the top three. In our region, so Africa, South Africa is the #1 producer, far and away, with a figure of 27 billion. And of course, just to frame that, Kenya's GDP hovers at around $40 billion. So you can really see what the size of that industry means to countries like Australia and South Africa. This slide here is just a graphical representation of what it takes to actually develop a mine, and this is how we need to temper our expectations. You see the first graph there, which talks about exploration. At the top, you see it says that's possibly 1 to 10 years. What does that mean? It means that you have a country like Kenya. Somebody has to do the prospecting, and then comes in and says, well, I think there's a likelihood that we have iron ore here, or copper, or rare earths, or whatever, niobium, as the case may be. But then, here's the catch. Somebody has to come with a very significant amount of money, which sometimes runs into tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, to do what the industry calls defining that deposit. Because contrary to popular opinion, not every occurrence of a mineral is economically viable. Once you identify a viable deposit, obviously you need to develop the infrastructure to exploit that resource. That could take anything up to 5 years, depending on obviously the scope of the project. And then obviously operations, and this is the main thing. Operations is where you do have your returns and your benefits. But to get there, you need to explore, you need to construct. So with operations, this is where now Kenya finds ourselves now, because the debate now is around what the country gets from operations. And the truth is, this is not different from anywhere else in the world. I see a lot of people here, I see very young faces. If you're in school, obviously, the main thing on your mind is, when I finish school, I need a job, So we need to have that debate. Now, mining, unless you have very many mines, and you have very large-scale mines, is unfortunately not a really significant employer in terms of numbers. That's what we want, that's good. Those are workers at base titanium, so we want happy workers. That we don't want our mines shut down, and this we definitely do not want, because this is at the Marikana mine in South Africa, anybody who's familiar with the news. So this is our chance, let's seize it and let's get it right. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Cliff, for putting everything in perspective. Grateful for that. I'd like to now invite the High Commissioner of Canada to Kenya and many other countries, David Angel. He represents Canada and Kenya, the High Commissioner to Rwanda, Uganda, Ambassador Designate to Burundi, Somalia and South Sudan, Canada's representative to the United Nations office in Nairobi, and David is going to put us all to shame when I read you his CV. Let me tell you. Undergraduate degree from Yale, MA International Relations, University of Toronto, MPhil International Relations, University of Cambridge, Commonwealth Scholar, served abroad in Washington, D.C. 91 to 93, in Northern Ireland as advisor to General Jean de Chastelain in the peace process 95-96, permanent mission to the United Nations in New York 96 to 201, alternative representative on the UN Security Council, 99 to 2000. High Commissioner in Nigeria, Ambassador to ECOWAS, 2004 to 2007. Served as the G8 Deputy Africa Personal Representative from 2001 to 2004, from 2007 to 2012 as the G8 Africa Personal Representative. Of course, wow. When did you ever do all this stuff between the studying? It's a real privilege to have His Excellency speak about the voluntary principles on security and human rights, about Canada's experience in the extractive industry, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Your Excellency's got to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ali Khan, for that very, very generous introduction. When I was leaving Nigeria, I teased my daughter and said that, sweetheart, you're going to have to call me Your Excellency when we go back to Canada because nobody else is going to. And she looked at me and said, but Daddy, you're not excellent. So for all the generosity in Ali Khan's comments, I do have kids who keep me very, very, very humble. Listen, it is a great pleasure to be with you, and it's a pleasure to be joining His Excellency the Ambassador of Switzerland in co-hosting this MindSpeak event on the voluntary principles on security and human rights. With regard to the voluntary principles, about 12, 13 years ago, around the turn of the millennium, a number of multi-stakeholder processes were created to address human rights issues relating to the extractive sector. Each of those involved several constituencies, government, companies, civil society, and the creation of these MSIs, multi-stakeholder initiatives, reflected a recognition that operating on their own, each of these constituencies could not do what was needed in order to make sure that the extractive sector had the human rights content that was necessary. But working together they could. And these were not natural relationships. These are constituencies that sometimes had operated in opposition to each other. And so this process of working together did not come about instinctively or naturally, but it's been extremely important. In 2012, the Toronto Stock Exchange and Toronto's ventures market accounted for 70% of the financing globally in this sector. This is an enormous role played by Canada. The extractive sector has been a key driver of our economy, but equally it has been an important source of prosperity in the regions where our companies operate, certainly including here in Africa and here in East Africa. My own belief is that within 5 or 10 or 15 years, companies in the extractive sector will be expected to subscribe to the voluntary principles. So Kenya, as Cliff has said, is a very new player in the extractive sector and still a very small one. But it can nonetheless show leadership and be a model in its commitment to human rights and its commitment to the VPs. And certainly I will be encouraging the government to look very seriously at becoming the first country in the region to be a full member of the voluntary principles process. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for that very interesting look at the voluntary principles and a lot else. I'd like to now introduce Evelyn Samba, who is the Deputy Commission Secretary at the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. Evelyn holds a master's degree in community development, a first degree in social work. She has close to 20 years experience in development work and worked for various organizations. In particular, Evelyn has hands-on experience in HRBA, community organizing, program design, is passionate about human rights, and hence will advocate for the protection and promotion of human rights in business. Evelyn, over to you.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I stand here in great awe of the things that have been said about our country, and and the opportunities that we face in the near future. As has been painted by the speakers before me, the future is bright for Kenya, especially around that sector. There's hope for employment, economic growth, infrastructure development, and all those things. But from where we stand as a commission, we are also very aware that the ever-present possibility of those things turning negative exists. It is very possible that there will be challenges, and we already know that in many of those places where we are speaking about discoveries and efforts to explore what is potential, challenges have already begun to emerge, especially around human rights, respect or lack of respect for human rights, violations and all that. So I dare say that at this point in time for the country, even as we look at those immense opportunities, it is about time that we sat back to look at what is it that we can learn as a country from others who have gone before us. What do we have that will protect us from proceeding in that path that we are so aware that it's likely to happen? And then looking internally to say, if this is where we are at and this is what we can do, what are we committing as a country to be able to forestall some of those challenges? Even for the people who are investing in that area, the companies that are coming in, they also have high expectations. So there is tension. There is very possibility that there will be tension insofar as matching and balancing those expectations. Because on one hand, the communities think this is their moment. These are things that are within us. It is our right, and it is their right. But then the companies are saying, we don't want to put money where we don't get profits. So how that is balanced is a challenge. In situations where, for example, minerals are being discovered, when communities have to be moved, even when the compensation is discussed or negotiated, it's really nothing to talk about. When you consider that this is your ancestral land, when you consider that this is where you've earned your living for centuries, when you consider that this is the future of your children. So again, that challenge exists, and as a country, I think it is important that we confront that. And for us who speak the language of human rights, that is a critical area of engagement for us. Understanding of the voluntary principles that have been talked about, and this is missing in most of our communities. We therefore watch and stand by and get amazed at the discoveries that are being made and the explorations that are going on without the ability to engage critically and ask certain questions about what is happening. So that if we are able then to infuse that knowledge in the communities, communities will stand in good stead to be able to ask certain questions. So the question as a country we need to ask is, how are we preparing our communities to be able to receive what we're discovering and to embrace it as their own? Are we putting in place a system that will allow for community engagement, for community ownership, so that when all is said and done, we are benefiting as a country together with the investors who are coming, because there's also something in it for them. Thank you very much.
Areas where potential conflicts are going to arise with expectations or very heightened expectations of the local community. I think going forward that's really key, and I'm glad that you're playing such a big role in that area. Thank you. I'm now going to turn to a friend of mine, Simon Wall. Of course, those folks who've been to MindSpeak before will recall that Tim Carstens, the CEO of Base Resources, made a presentation, I think it was about 2 years ago now, and Simon is coming to speak a little bit about what's happening down there in Kwale. It is, of course, the biggest mining project I think we have in Kenya. Am I right, Cliff, at the moment? And therefore, so much hinges on the success of that project. Just to come to Simon. Simon was born and raised in Sydney, Australia. Following an undergraduate degree from the University of Sydney, Simon travelled extensively and began working in the development aid sector. He returned to Sydney to complete a Master's in International Studies before working for the Australian Government's Department of Foreign Affairs. What I think I've learned is that a bachelor's degree is of no good and no use anymore. Everyone's got a master's or, oh my. Complete a Master's in International Studies before working for the Australian Government's Department of Foreign Affairs. Simon has spent 3 years as a diplomat in Nairobi before crossing over to the private sector. He's now Manager of External Affairs at Base Titanium. The floor is yours, Simon.
It's a real privilege for me to be here this morning to be part of the MindSpeak community. For a while now, I've been stalking Ali Khan on Twitter and always look forward to his reporting for these events. I'd never quite imagined that I'd be so intimately involved in one. So thank you for inviting me. As we all know, and we've heard this morning, there's considerable excitement being generated over the last couple of years around the extractive sector in Kenya. The fact that we're here today to discuss transparency, best practices and management of the sector is clear evidence that Kenya is experiencing a degree of transformation when it comes to mining oil and gas. I like to feel that base titanium has played a small role in generating this excitement. The benefits that an extractive sector can bring to a country. At its core, the development of guidelines and principles for the sector, whether it be EITI, IFC performance standards, equatorial principles or voluntary principles or any of the others, at their core, what they're really about is ensuring that a country's natural resource endowment benefits people, not just today, but for future generations. So why EITI for base? When establishing base titanium, a lot of thought was given to the type of company we wanted to build. We call it living the base way. These principles, which I'll highlight, are written into every employee's job descriptions and play a major role in performance assessment. They've become the DNA of our organisation. So living the base way, what does it include? The potential of people, taking responsibility for safety, promoting a can-do attitude, self-improving and encouraging others to do likewise. I'll be the first to agree that mining companies, because of the nature of our work, have obligations to their local communities that possibly don't exist for other commercial businesses. But it's also important to ensure that the taxes and royalties paid by mining companies, often running into the millions of dollars, are spent in a clear and transparent manner by governments and in a way that invests in the long-term economic development of a country, a region and a county. Both mining companies and governments must be held accountable for the taxes paid and how the revenue is spent. We've estimated that over the 13-year life of the Kwale Mineral Sands project, we will pay close to US dollars 220 million in direct payments to the government of Kenya. No small amount, I'm sure you'll agree. However, over the life of the mine, our estimate is that we'll spend close to US dollars 900 million on operational costs, the vast majority of this spending occurring directly into the Kenyan economy. These costs include things like energy, fuel, wages, food, servicing of vehicles, general maintenance, the stuff that keeps the business going. So let me close by taking this opportunity to encourage the government of Kenya to sign up to not just EITI, but all the other international standards and principles we've heard about today. I'd also like to encourage all the people in the room to challenge your governments to do the same. By doing so, we have the best possible chance of building an extractive sector that is transparent, accountable, and benefits Kenyans for generations to come. As I said, base titanium is EITI compliant. Out of interest, you'll see that last financial year, base paid US dollars 16.7 million to the government of Kenya. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
When Simon puts it out like that, right? I mean, that's nearly $1 billion operational spend in that area of Kenya, which has to be a good thing, I would say. Thank you very much to all my panelists. And now, as Simon said, we can throw it open to the audience. And if anyone's got any burning issues.
To Cliff, I would like to ask, in terms of the opportunities that present for legal firms within the industry, the mining industry, as you have rightly pointed out, we don't have so much legislation, but how can we as a company, a legal firm, position ourselves in order to take advantage within the next 10 years? To His Excellency the High Commissioner of Canada, considering your interactions with Kenya and based on your long history in the mining industry, what legal steps should we as a country undertake in order to reach where you have reached. So in terms of our policy and trickling it down to the industries, the particular industries, what should our law firms do, what should our other businesses do in terms of the mining companies. So just if you could just highlight some of the issues that we should undertake in order to develop capacity in a legal forum. To base titanium, this is from Simon. What have you had as the major legal challenges in terms of setting up your business and in terms of day-to-day operation? Thank you.
I think my question is I think I'm directed to Mr. Oteka. Is with regards to the issue of competitiveness versus transparency. We are asking companies to be transparent about the monies or disclose the monies that they're giving to governments through AET, for example. But those transparency initiatives like AET or the Dodd-Frank legislation are going to turn out to be expensive or costly for investing funds. So I'm asking, how do we want to speak about initiatives that will make it costly for funds to invest, yet we are also saying we need to make our countries competitive for investment? How are we going to deal with these two issues? To make ourselves competitive, but again to handle issues of transparency.
Obviously, this is a high-stakes industry, so our legal fraternity can add the most value by ensuring that companies that operate in this sector, both local and foreign, because we often talk about foreign companies, but we know we have a lot of issues locally here as well with governance and things like that. So I think that is the most important role that legal firms can play. Turning to competitiveness versus transparency. Well, that's a good question, and I think basically we all agree that something is only too expensive when the costs outweigh the benefit. And this industry is mature enough to understand that the costs of non-disclosure, from the examples that we see and are well known around the world, are much higher than the costs of disclosure. So while these, what we discussed today around the EITI and the voluntary principles are obviously voluntary for now, I think it's imperative that we get on board today, because the thing with mining, I always like to say that whatever policy you have, whatever framework, you will attract miners. It's just the quality of the miners that you'll attract. And it's just like they all say, you know, if you let a snake into your house, ultimately it'll kick you out.
I know we got over time, but it was a very interesting and engaging debate, and I'd like to thank His Excellency Jacques Mitterrand of the Swiss Embassy, His Excellency David Angel of the Canadian Embassy for the support he gave us to us today. I'd like to thank my panelists, Cliff, Evelyn, and Simon, for such an engaging and wide-ranging debate. And I'd like to invite the audience, if you want to pigeonhole anybody, this is your opportunity. And I'd like to thank you all for being such an engaging part of the conversation. And once again, thank you everybody for this really wonderful MindSpeak. Thank you.